Hello, and welcome to The Season, the podcast from FYCit that goes behind the scenes of award season. I'm your host, Ryland Aldrich, the creator of the FYCit app. I'm looking forward to sharing my conversation this week with Will Files. Will is a sound designer, editor, and mixer with multiple Emmy wins and an Oscar nomination. He's in the awards race this season with a number of films and even received 3 MPSC Golden Reel nominations since we recorded the interview, 1 for Saturday Night and 2 for Alien Romulus. Before we get to that, here's a quick look at the calendar for the week ahead. Thursday, the day this episode drops, we'll be getting nominations from 3 of the big craft award shows, the Writers Guild Awards, the Art Directors Guild Awards, and the ASC Awards. Friday the 10th brings us the PGA's nominations, as well as the celebration for the AFI Awards. Saturday is the AARP Movies for Grown-Up Awards, while Sunday the 12th is the 30th Annual Critics' Choice Awards. It's also the day that Oscar nomination balloting closes, which has been open since Wednesday. Monday is a big day for voters as final polls open for the WGA, PGA, ASC, CDG, and the MOAs. Next Tuesday, we'll see the nominations announced for VES, as well as our Gallica friends and their Dorian Awards nominations. Finally, Wednesday the 15th completes a busy week, between podcasts at least, with the nominees announced for BAFTA. It's been a slow trickle of screenings being added as we approach nominations. Nickel Boys from Amazon MGM and Inside Out 2 from Disney led the week with 4 screenings added each. Have you seen everything left on your list before voting? Check out the FYCit app to find all the screenings for the top contenders. Now let's get to my conversation with Will Files. Joining us today on The Season is Will Files, an Oscar-nominated 4-time Emmy-winning supervising sound editor and re-recording mixer, whose work has shaped some of the most memorable audio environments in modern film and television. So far, Will has amassed 19 MPSC Golden Reel nominations and 4 wins for projects including Stranger Things, War for the Planet of the Apes, Cloverfield, Prey, and The Batman, the film that earned him an Academy Award nomination. Now he's back in the awards conversation with this season's sound contender, Alien Romulus, amongst other films. Whether he's building the sonic backbone of a legacy franchise or pioneering fresh audio approaches, Will offers a comprehensive view of sound design's role on the awards season stage. So Will, how's your season?
It's been busy, blessedly. I had a very lucky, fortunate year. I got to work on a lot of really amazing movies, and it's been fun because people seem to be wanting to talk about them.
Yeah, you're heading into the season having worked on no less than 4 awards contenders: Saturday Night, The Bike Riders, Better Man, and of course, Alien Romulus, which is shortlisted for the Sound Oscar. So just sort of to set the stage for us, what order did all of these projects happen? Did you think of them all as a chance to have these 4 contending projects that you were working on?
I never try to think about that kind of stuff ahead of time because, frankly, you just never know. And also, it's sort of like putting the cart before the horse in my mind. So I always just try to approach every film trying to figure out what that film needs aesthetically and just try to do the very best job we can do to try to help the director, bring their vision to life, essentially. But in terms of, how I ended up with essentially 4 movies in the same year, partly it was sort of a scheduling fluke with The Bike Riders because that was actually supposed to come out last year. We had finished that last year. It was supposed to be released in, I think it was December. It's like right around Christmas. So, basically a year ago. There was a switch up between distributors. Luckily, a lot of people did have a chance to see it in the theater and, it was well received, but it was really just a fluke that it ended up in this Oscar season versus last Oscar season. And I suppose in some other ways, you could even say the other ones were a fluke too. I mean, I certainly didn't go into working on Alien Romulus as thinking it was going to be an awards contender. And, frankly, that's just not the kind of movie that normally gets that kind of attention.
Sure.
It's a franchise picture in a long franchise. It's been 40 plus years of Alien movies. And, it's sci-fi, which unfortunately, I don't think sci-fi gets quite as much attention as it should these days on the sound front. It used to be that was, what got all the attention. And I think partly because there's so many sci-fi films out now, and also so much ground has been covered sonically in that world. If you think back to what Ben Burtt first did in Star Wars back in the 70s and what the team on the first Alien film did back in the late 70s, it was so groundbreaking. it's hard, frankly, to break that kind of ground.
Yeah, I want to get into some of the details of how you created that sound a little bit later. But before we do, just getting, a little bit deeper into award season, you have had quite a few nominations and quite a few recognitions and awards. So you say you're not thinking at all about a project being an awards contender, but it seems that when people are hiring you, they're thinking about your pedigree. They know that you've worked on a lot of these award-winning films and TV shows. So it must cross your mind a little bit like, oh gosh, this one, I'm really knocking it out of the park here.
It's tempting to allow yourself to think that. And I'd be lying if I didn't say it didn't cross my mind sometimes. For example, musicals have a long history of getting nominations for sound. There's plenty of amazing sounding musical films, but it can be one of those things that is almost automatic in some sense. And I never liked the idea of anything getting, recognized or nominated automatically just because it has singing in it or something,
right,
and music in it. But when I got a call to work on Better Man, of course it crossed my mind. It's a musical, that never hurts in terms of awards, but, let's see what the movie is. And then I saw the movie and I was like, oh my God, this movie is incredible. And at that point, it almost became more of a, if this movie doesn't get some kind of recognition, it'll be a shame.
Right.
Not even for me and my team, but just the film is just so, bold and different and beautiful. And, it does sound amazing and the music is amazing. And I would say the same thing about when I, got a call from Jason Reitman to come work on the Saturday Night film. And the very first thing he said to me was, the sound in this film is more important than any other film I've ever made. And when a director says something like that to you, you pay attention, right?
Where do you think he was coming from with a comment like that?
One of Jason's biggest assets and skills as a director, I think, is being really clear about setting expectations. He's really clear about what he cares about and what he expects in terms of quality and where to spend the effort and where not to spend the effort. He's open to ideas. He's willing to hear other people's thoughts. He's not like a tyrant or anything, but he also is one of those great directors, like most of the great directors I work with, who has a very clear vision. And those are the kind of people that I always want to work with, the people who have the movie in their head already to some degree, but then are still open to ideas to making things even better. But yeah, when he said that, it was clear to me that we had to, bring our A game, which, I would always do on one of Jason's movies, but it sets a little bit of fear in your heart in a good way, because he's basically telling me how much he cares about the sound. And like I said, what the expectation of quality and excellence is. So there's not going to be any aspect of this job that's going to be like phoning it in or cutting a corner. It's like everything has to be a 10, basically.
So you've said in the past that peer-driven accolades like MPSC Golden Reel Awards can sometimes feel a little bit more meaningful. How are awards groups like MPSC and CAS different when it comes to what voters are looking for as compared to, say, the Oscars?
Well, I think on the nomination side, it's a little the same, because in the Oscar world, your branch, so in my case, the sound branch, does all the nominations. But then once it gets out of the nomination phase, it goes to the general membership to vote on. So at that point, you are putting it out to vote to people that don't necessarily understand the craft. So, it's not to say that it never works, because I do think that a lot of times the Academy membership does vote for what I would think was the best, choice for the year. But then sometimes the membership votes for something and you go, huh, really? Okay, I guess, all right, fine. Once you get to that phase, obviously you're dealing with 5 movies that all sound excellent, but it's a hard thing to really understand what we do. Sound is a very esoteric topic, even within the community, it's hard to talk about sometimes. So it does tend to be a bit uninformed electorate that's voting for the final winner. Now, if you contrast that to the Guild Awards, like the Motion Picture Sound Editors, the Cinema Audio Society, some of the other, more sort of technical, if you want to call it that, although I sort of prefer the word, craftsperson-esque, because what we do really isn't that technical. But if you have the same group of people doing the nomination and the voting, and all those people are craftspeople who pretty deeply understand the work, then you do tend to get a little bit of a different outcome sometimes.
So many people in the sound community, it seemed, thought Oppenheimer was a real front runner last year when it came time to vote for the General Academy. There was Zone of Interest that came away with it. Were you surprised by that pick?
I was a bit surprised, but at the same time, nothing against Oppenheimer at all, because it sounded amazing. But the thing that I was thinking about when Zone of Interest won was that maybe the coolest thing about that was that the sound made the biggest impact on the film. Meaning, if you muted the sound for any of the movies that were nominated and watched the movies, that would be the one that would feel the most different. That would be the one that the story would actually be different.
Right.
It's the choices that were made of how to shoot what you were seeing versus what you were hearing. There was a lot of contrast there between what was seen and what was heard. And a lot of the meaning in the film was actually derived from the suspension between the two. Right. So, even though Oppenheimer was an incredible soundtrack, I thought Zone of Interest probably deserved it, at least in the sense that, like I said, it was inherent to the success of the film. Mm-hmm. And that's cool when sound can do that.
Bringing it back to your career, you'd had so much success with the peer group awards. What was it like to finally get that call that you had been nominated for an Academy Award for The Batman in 2023?
It was great. It was very satisfying. I think that I had gotten a little jaded over the years because I had, I'd never had a bite at that apple, right? And it's one of those things that at a certain point you go, okay, well, maybe I'm just never going to get an Oscar nomination. And, you make your peace with that and you go, well, it's just a show. It's just a statue, right? So it's easy to sort of write it off in your head and go, I don't care if I get an Oscar nomination or not. And then, of course, you get an Oscar nomination and you have to admit, okay, it feels pretty cool. And, the reality is not that many people ever get an Oscar nomination in their life. It's pretty rarefied air. So I wouldn't ever want to say, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. And yeah, it felt good. I can't lie. It did feel good to finally get a swing at that, even though we all kind of knew Top Gun was probably going to win. It was still a fun thing to be a part of.
So when you're walking into the theater that night, you said you had been to the Oscars before, but walking in as a nominee, how are the emotions, even knowing you're a bit of an underdog?
Well, it was fun. I mean, of course, you're a little bit on edge. And I managed to get through most of the ceremony without a whole lot of anxiety because I was so convinced that we weren't going to win. And then, of course, it gets to the category right before ours. And then I'm like, but wait, what if we did win? Oh, no. What am I going to say? So, panic set in a little bit at that point, just because I wasn't really emotionally prepared to go accept an Oscar in front of 100 million people. But I'm sure I could have pulled it together if we would have gotten lucky and if they would have drawn our name. But it's definitely a little nerve-wracking when the clock starts ticking down.
So I've always wanted to know this. Obviously, with the sound, there's a number of nominees. There were 4 nominated for The Batman. Did you guys discuss who was going to speak? Had the award been given to you? Did you talk about order you would talk in? Did you have a speech prepared?
We did. Yeah, we had talked about it. And essentially, I was encouraging my supervising partner, Doug, to take the lead because he had told me before we went to the show that he was planning on retiring after the film. So I was thinking, if we win and this is his last, big movie as a supervisor, then I really want him to have a chance to speak because, he's quite a bit older than me and I might be lucky enough to get another shot at this someday. And I just thought it would be a really sweet way to put a cherry on top of his amazing career to go out. And it just would have been a lot of fun to see him up there, next to me giving a talk.
So when you reflect back on The Batman, was there an aspect of the sound design that you're particularly proud was recognized by the Academy?
A lot of my favorite things in that sound mix and, sound edit were the subtleties. There was so much subtlety in that track that wasn't all, things blowing up. And in fact, there wasn't a lot of that. There was moments for sure. But, speaking of big, loud things, the other thing that I was really happy with how it turned out was the Batmobile chase. There's this one sound in the film for the Batmobile when he first turns it on. And it's sort of like hiding in the darkness. And it's the way Matt Reeves, our director, explained it to me, was that Bruce would have, he designed this thing himself. He built it himself, and he built it to like look and sound intimidating. He wanted it to sound like, of course, grounded and plausible and real, but also like kind of terrifying. And so then the job was, okay, well, how do I figure out what feels like that, but still feels like it could be a car? And so I was playing around with all kinds of different kind of, animals and, whirring, screeching, things like that. And I came across an old recording I had of a bottle rocket. And it's just this really quick 1 second woo kind of thing. But it had this like banshee screech kind of element to it. And I thought, if I could figure out a way to, make that 30 seconds long, it has the kind of feel that I want. It has this like sort of hair raising, awful, almost like, hurts your teeth kind of feel. And I remembered this video I'd seen on YouTube years ago where someone took a Justin Bieber song and ran it through this weird piece of software that slowed it down like 800% or something like that, so that it lasted like, half an hour or something like that. And it turned it into this like weirdly haunting, beautiful sound. And I was thinking, well, okay, let me track down whatever weird research piece of software that was. It was some like command line piece of software. And I found it and I tried putting this sound into it, and it took a 1 second sound and it turned it into like a minute long of this like crazy howl. And that became the signature sound of the Batmobile. And that's one of the coolest things about sound is like you can discover these just bizarre like things that like they shouldn't work. I mean, a tiny little bottle rocket shouldn't sound like the Batmobile, and yet it has the right feeling. That's the coolest thing about the job in my mind, is that you can put these things together that don't really make any sense, but if they feel right emotionally, then it works for the film.
Yeah, when you talk about that, I really see why you say that just calling it a technical role doesn't sum it up. It's so much art and artistry and craftsmanship, like you said. I
mean, I think it's like nearly any other art, there's always an element of craft and even technical skill needed. I mean, you learn a lot of skills and you package those all together into something we call technique.
So let's talk about the technique used in Alien Romulus. I'd imagine working on a legacy franchise like Alien comes with a lot of expectations, especially from awards bodies that remember the original iconic sound you talked about earlier. How do you balance the legacy elements that voters might expect with new sonic directions? And I would imagine that there weren't a lot of original Alien effects for you to make use of.
Yeah, I mean, there was essentially none. We've been lucky to work on a few of these kind of legacy franchises in the last few years, movies like Ghostbusters, Predator, things like that. And we were lucky on those films that there was actually quite a lot of archival material that we could use to pepper things in and then, build on that. Or, in some cases, like for Ghostbusters, we got really lucky and we found a bunch of alternate takes, like work tapes that had, sort of unused versions of similar kinds of sounds. So we were able to use those to build on the palette that we're all familiar with from the original films. But on Alien Romulus, we didn't have that luxury. So we really didn't have any archival sounds. So the challenge at that point became recreating sounds that weren't mimicking the original sounds, but they felt like they were in that universe. So it was a lot of listening to the film and trying to figure out what they might have used for some of this stuff and trying to figure out, how they might have processed some of this stuff back then with the, primitive tools that they had in the 70s. And then really kind of trying to wrap our heads around the aesthetic and like the rhythm of the sounds and the sort of tonal qualities of the sounds and just the character of the sounds. And one of the things that we really hit on was that a lot of the choices that they made were really left turn choices. Like they would put a lot of really unusual, like animalistic, weird, bizarre vocal things in for like computers and things like that didn't necessarily make sense, but they had a feel. And so trying to embrace the weird as much as possible, trying to embrace this sort of everything's a little broken or about to break kind of feeling. And then really trying to lean into recreating a lot of the same kind of rhythms and tonalities that the original film had, so that it felt like we had just found a huge library of sounds that were not used in the original film, but really everything was completely made from scratch. Even something like the pulse rifle, which, that was one of those things that we go back and listen to the second Alien film, Aliens, and it's got this really cool, very recognizable sound. But when you listen to it, you realize it's actually very low fidelity. It actually doesn't sound big and modern at all. It sounds very thin and kind of like, I don't want to say goofy, but it doesn't sound punchy and big and cool at all. So that was something that we had to, like, Fede really wanted that to sound punchy and concussive, but still have that character that the original film did, where it has that kind of phasey sound to it. So that was quite a bit of R&D. And then there was this general approach to how do you make a movie that's shot, in a modern way, that's being mixed in, Dolby Atmos and, 128 channels. How do we give the audience a modern cinema experience, but still somehow make it feel authentic and in that world, the same way that Fede wanted to do with the visuals, where, he did shoot the film on digital, but then he shot so much of it practically, with practical effects and real lighting interaction and the kind of things that made things feel real, like they did back in the 80s and 90s and 70s. And then he spent a lot of time working on the film look and the film grain and adding those sort of imperfections in post-production so that it gave it that kind of authentic lived-in feeling like the original ones had. So we wanted to try to figure out what would be the audio equivalent of that. So we spent a lot of time experimenting with different tape effects, tape saturation, tape distortion, because everything back then would have been recorded on tape and mixed on magnetic film. So there was quite a few generations of magnetic recording in between what they heard on set and what you would have heard either in the theater or eventually in home video. And that was a big part of the sound that we all remember. So we did a bunch of experimenting and tried to figure out, how far should we go with this, with adding this sort of audio film grain. And we did a version where we made it basically sound identical to the original film, but it was so distorted and so gnarly that the studio freaked out about it. And Fede loved it, of course, but the studio was like, we can't release it this way. There'll be a riot at the theater. And I'm sure they were right. To some degree, it was too far, but we had to go too far to find something that felt like enough of an homage to the original and enough sort of feeling of authenticity without completely alienating, a modern audience. So we ended up, basically the entire film is, has the equivalent of audio film grain on it.
Well, obviously there's some filmmakers who are so obsessed when it comes to the image, shooting on film and using specific lenses from the eras. I'm just curious, are there any filmmakers who say, actually, we're going to record the audio on analog as well and really push for that level of authenticity when it comes to sound?
Well, it's funny. I just did The Wolfman for Lee Winnell, and I was telling him a bit about what we did on Alien Romulus, and he was so enchanted by the idea that he was like, well, what if we actually, when we finish the mix, if we transferred the whole thing to tape, and then back. And I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. Let's try it. And then, of course we asked the studio and, got a quote for how much that would cost. And they were not interested in doing that.
And you said, luckily I know how to do it digitally now. So
right. Well, that's the good thing is the tech has come a long way in that regard. I really do believe there's nothing quite like film. There's nothing quite like tape. There's something about the, real analog processes that they just have such a high degree of variation, variability, randomness that it's just hard to really recreate, but you can get pretty darn close. close enough that it gives you the same kind of feeling that you got from the original. So we ended up going that route.
So when this episode airs, nomination voting for the Oscars will have just gotten underway. Alien Romulus is shortlisted for the Sound Oscar. And I have a feeling you're going to say you don't really care if it gets nominated, but how are you feeling right now? What's your mindset as we sit here on the eve of learning what the nominees will be?
Look, of course, I'd love to get a nomination, right? I mean, it's a fun party. I'd be thrilled to have that accolade from my peers. That would mean a lot. I'm going to try as hard as I can to not care about it because I already don't get enough sleep as it is. And it's not going to change my life, realistically. I mean, if anything, it's going to probably mean I've got a lot more to do in the next couple months if I do get a nomination. But no, I'd be thrilled. I mean, of course, I'd be thrilled to be in the company of my other peers that are on the short list. In my mind, all those films are easily deserving of getting a nomination. So I could hardly be offended if we don't get one, but I would be thrilled if we did, of course.
So the Best Sound Oscar today is a single category that blends both editing and mixing. As someone who often does both, can you explain the difference between the two disciplines?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I think I'll actually use a visual metaphor.
Sure.
So it's a little hard to understand, and sometimes it's even hard really to understand within the community what exactly contributed to a certain moment feeling a certain way. And usually it's some combination of the two. But the way I usually like to try to describe it is using visual metaphor, where when you go to shoot a scene on set, you have the production designer and the art director, and they design a set and they fill it up with all sorts of, objects that, contribute to telling the story. And a lot of thought goes into every single thing that's there and why things look a certain way. And it's all story related, right? And then the director of photography comes along, the cinematographer, and he essentially decides how the audience is going to experience those things. Mm-hmm. So, by using light, by using lens selection and shot selection, and a lot of that is sort of a process of removal or obfuscation, or essentially choosing what to focus the audience's eye on from moment to moment, right? To best tell the story. So I tend to think of those two things as sound design, sound editing, and sound mixing. So sound design and sound editing, that's like building a set, filling it full of all the things that tell the story in the scene. And then mixing is more like cinematography, where you're deciding, okay, now I have all these hundreds of tracks of things. Now, how am I going to tailor the audience's experience of how they're experiencing those things? And I think that that's the easiest way I've found to explain the sort of esoteric process of what we do.
Right. So obviously production design and cinematography are two separate Oscars. Do you see it as a plus or minus that the Academy decided to combine the two sound categories into one Oscar?
I have mixed feelings about it. I do find that even though I do both jobs, in my mind, they are different jobs. I think it's a bit of a shame that they got combined, because I think it ultimately gives less films an opportunity to be recognized for what they did really well. Because some films, it is more about the mixing. For example, a lot of musicals, they are, primarily about the mixing, and not to say that editing is a huge part of that. I mean, especially when you have a movie like Wicked, where they're recording things on set, live on set, and then you have to combine them with post-production elements. But it is the kind of movie that would more obviously be recognized for mixing. Whereas a sci-fi film or an animated film or something where you're creating like everything from scratch with sound editing and sound design, that's the kind of film that traditionally would get more love from the sound editing side. But the reality is, over the years, the Academy found that something like there was like a 90% correlation between editing and mixing nominations. And I think that just speaks to just how hard it is to pull the two things apart, even within our own branch, because our branch, of course, was the ones doing the nominations there. So I wouldn't necessarily expect the Academy membership at large to understand the distinctions between the two, because it is hard to understand. But even within our own branch, it's actually can be hard to understand. And the data kind of shows that. So I understand why the change was made. And I guess we'll just see how it plays out over the next few years.
Yeah, well, maybe more people in the Academy need to hear your production design cinematography metaphor, because that
maybe so.
That's great. I'm going to think about that from now on. You mentioned the difference in some of the genres between mixing and editing, and you've worked in a pretty wide variety of genres: sci-fi, drama, comedy, and even animation. I'm curious if there's one that you prefer over the others?
No, there actually isn't. You know, I one of the things I love about my job is that every project is different. And I love jumping between, for example, this year, the 4 movies you mentioned at the top of the show couldn't be more different. You know, you've got in Bike Riders, it's a gritty period piece with basically no score. It's all scored with vintage, oldies songs, needle drops, and motorcycles, and very, very kind of raw sound. And then you've got Saturday Night, which is like a 70s homage, very like verite kind of style, but wanted to do a very Altman kind of thing with it, with lots of overlapping dialogue and panning the dialogue, and very avant-garde score with from Jean-Baptiste, and tried to keep it really fresh and light on its feet, to feel like the movie did, which was like, it felt live. It felt like, it was crackling with energy. And then you've got Better Man, which is, a musical, but it's also a musical with a lot of edge, and a lot of, sort of high concept stuff, ultimately about a rock star, but it's also starring, a monkey doing drugs, basically. And then you've got Alien Romulus, which is, a sort of old school in the best way possible sci-fi, hard sci-fi, gritty, dirty sci-fi. And then like a project I have coming up in this year is the next SpongeBob movie. And I'm really looking forward to that, because like, I remember the post supervisor asked me, he was like, do you really want to like do a, kids animated movie, after doing, the year that you've had? And I was like, yes, I really, really do. Like, I need it. Because it's like a nice palate cleanser. That's one of the fun things about the job, is you get to work on so many different kind of genres. It keeps it fresh.
Do you think that there's one of those genres that is the most underrated by voters typically?
Yes, I think that animation does not get enough love, especially for sound. I was really lucky about 20 years ago. I got to work on The Incredibles with Randy Tom and Michael Silvers. And we actually got nominated that year, and we won, when it was still best sound editing. Right. And my name wasn't on it, because I wasn't the supervisor at that point, but I got to go, and, it was a lot of fun. I was a lot younger at that point. That was, as far as I can think, that was the last film that won for best sound as an animated film. Huh. And there's very few films that have even been nominated for best sound as an animated film. And in my mind, sound is such a big part of animation, and it's one of the most creative genres for sound, because everything is created. Even a movie like Alien Romulus, where so much is being created after the fact, we have something to go off of, at least we've got, if somebody closes the door, you're going to have some kind of sound. It might sound like a fake set door, but at least you've got some sound there. Versus with animation, literally every single sound is totally fabricated. And it also, just as a genre, has a lot of room for creativity and doing interesting sound work. So it's a shame that I think maybe it's something where it's like looked down on as being like more for kids or something, but there's a lot of hard and creative work that goes into doing animation and doing sound for animation. So I do wish it would get more attention.
That's great. So we like to end all of our interviews on the season with a lightning round, just quick questions and quick answers.
Okay, I'll do my best. I'm not always good at quick answers.
What's your favorite award show to attend?
On the Oscars.
What is your favorite film festival to attend?
Probably Sundance, as long as I've got good boots.
Do you prefer Emmy season or Oscar season?
I prefer Oscar season, because Emmy season is too hot to be wearing a suit.
Good answer. Do you have a post-award season ritual?
Depends on, I guess, the award season. But after the last time I got an Oscar nomination, I spent a month not drinking.
What is your favorite past appetizer at a screening reception?
Good question. I'm a sucker for a canapé, like a little tuna tartare or something like that. I mean, if we're talking fancy, I'll take a potato chip with caviar, please.
Do you have a least favorite award speech cliche?
Oh yeah. When they, I'd like to thank my agent. I'd like to thank, look, nothing wrong with agents. I love agents. I love my agent especially, but it's just so funny when you, when you see somebody get up there and they don't thank their family. They don't thank their creative partners. All they want to thank is the studio and their, agent and who got them paid. And it's just like, really? Okay.
Do you prefer to watch FYC screenings at home or in the theater?
I prefer watching everything in the theater if I can, but the reality of a working filmmaker's life is that I watch a lot more of them at home. But I've got a pretty good home theater, and I try to watch them as loud as I can.
At an award show, do you prefer theater or table seating?
That's a good question. I actually probably prefer table seating, especially if there's a bottle of wine in the middle.
Final question: what is one early award season prediction that you're willing to make?
Oh, I'm going to go with something that I'm hoping for more than anything, that Saturday Night gets a editing nomination.
Great. Will Files, thank you so much for joining us on this season. This was really fun.
All right. Thank you very much.
We're back, and I'm here with our FYCit field agent, Tony Miros. Whether he's in LA, New York, or Miami, Tony is always staying on top of everything happening in FYC screening world. So, Tony, what'd you get up to this week?
Oh boy, what a week. Yeah, I was in Miami and now I'm in New York again. I went to see The Fire Inside. It's a directorial debut from Academy Award nominated cinematographer Rachel Morrison. And it's about this boxing woman. I didn't even know this story at all. I was so excited about hearing about this. And I had a great time watching. It was at the Whitby Hotel. Remember I told you I went to the Whitby?
Yeah.
It was really I love that space. It's now my new favorite screening room. Sorry, Paramount. This is actually my favorite screening room now. The space they have is downstairs. So you walk in through the front, you take the elevator or the stairs downstairs, and it's a very upscale. There's 3 rooms. There's one room where where the restrooms are, but it's kind of like a lounge area, so you can have a cocktail reception. Then there is the middle room, which has the bar, and it's a really large room, and they offer you candies and bottled water prior to the screening. That's one of the reasons I love it. And then the screening room, which is really modern and new, and the seats are all orange. It's a little like, oh, what is this? Spacey kind of look, but it's actually a very cool space. It's one of my favorites now.
About how big? How many seats?
I think it's like 120.
Got
so
it.
It's not too small, but it's not too big.
Mm-hmm.
But it's perfect. I mean, if you were to have an event in New York, something like where you're going to have a Q&A and a little reception, perfect. That's actually where I went to the reception for Jessica Lange. Remember when I went to the Lillian Hall thing?
Sure.
That was good. Yeah. Then I went and saw Blink Twice with Channing Tatum and Naomi Ackie. I think that's her name. But it was fascinating. I was like, wait a minute. I didn't even know this movie existed. Luckily, I got to go see it. And it was at the Tribeca screening room. And it is this building. It's a really nice building. It's a brick building. It used to be a coffee factory, this building. But it has also not only the screening room, it has a great grill, the Tribeca Grill Loft, where you can do a whole huge reception. And the paintings on the wall are of Robert De Niro's father. He painted them, if you didn't know that. But the other fun fact is that movie mogul Harvey Weinstein, this was his regular place to hang out, was the restaurant, because the Weinstein offices were right above. So it has all of that too going on. So you should have seen me walking around going, ooh, what's that? Ooh, what's that? This screening room's cool. I mean, it's regular screening room. It's like 72 seats, great Dolby sound.
Is this the building that they do all of the events during the festival at? I've been, it's like sort of takes up an entire block there, and it has, you kind of go in and take the elevator up, and then you've got this big open restaurant area at the top there.
Yeah. That's where it started. But I know that I asked them, I said, is this where the festival happens? She goes, well, the actual festival, because it's so big, has now moved over to Spring Street. But they do have things that happen there because that's where their offices are.
Right. So, I think that's where they have the badge pickup and all those kind of things.
Yeah. And it's a Tribeca, if you haven't been to Tribeca, it's really cool down there. I mean, it was funny. I was walking back to the subway and I turned a corner and there's all these people standing in front of this firehouse. And I'm like, why are they standing there? And then I noticed that the Ghostbusters sign is outside the firehouse. And I go, wait a minute. Is that the firehouse from the Ghostbusters movie? And yep, there it was. I didn't even know it was there. Literally bumped into it. I was like, oh, I guess I should take some pictures. But it's really cool down in Tribeca. I'm going to go back down and do some more investigating, I think.
So we're getting towards the nomination part of the season, but we still have screenings going on. They're not coming quite as thick and fast anymore. Do you still have some stuff on your schedule for the next week?
I do. I'm going to go see a documentary, Will and Harper, at the Paris Theater. You know, I love the Paris Theater. I'm going to see Nickel Boys again, only this time with a Q&A with the director and co-writer at the MoMA Museum over here off of Avenue of the Americas. So that's, again, going forward to see the screening area and all that. And then Hard Truths at the Whitby Hotel with a Q&A with the actors. So yay, back to the Whitby I go.
Hard Truths is a fascinating film, so I'm interested to hear what you think about that one.
Well, on my list, I still have a list, believe it or not, but I'm getting through it. You know, awards are right around the corner. I got to know what's going on.
That's right. Thank you so much to Tony Miros, our FYCit field agent, and another thanks to Will Files for a fascinating discussion. We'd love to hear what you think of this season. You can leave us a review on your podcast app or drop us a line at podcast@fycit.app. If you enjoyed today's episode, please tell a friend. And don't forget to follow us on social media at FYCit app. You can also visit fycit.app to sign up for our newsletter, download the FYCit app, and stay up to date on everything happening in award season. Join us again next week for another episode of The Season as we dive deeper into the stories behind the awards. Until then, remember, at FYCit, award season starts here.